This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1032, a conversation with CHRIS ELIOPOULOS.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1032. It's a conversation with CHRIS ELIOPOULOS. CHRIS was an acclaimed letterer. And actually, I don't think I realized this until we had our conversation, or maybe just prior to doing the research, but he was actually the one who created the Virtual Calligraphy lettering studio. So I was really excited to kind of talk to him about the beginnings of that. He's also worked on the fantastic Ordinary People Change the World series with Brad Meltzer, which also gave rise to a popular, PBS show, Xavier Riddle. It's interesting. As a Canadian, I wasn't as aware of it. Turns out, I guess it was on TVO. But I find it's not a channel I really think of anymore. It's funny, actually, growing up as a kid in Canada, TVO was like one of the biggest things you'd watch for children's programming. You had TVO and you had, CBC in the mornings, when you were a little kid, because you had shows like Today's Special, you had Under the Umbrella Tree, Fred Penner's Place, those kinds of stuff. American audiences are like, I don't know what you're talking about. Under the Umbrella Tree, I always like to talk about that because Under the Umbrella Tree was about these three puppets that lived under an umbrella tree inside this apartment with this human person, which I don't think until I was an adult I really realized that they all, I understand it was Jacob Blue Jay. So J and J, you had Gloria Gopher, G and G, Iggy the Iguana, I and I. And then you had Holly the Human. And I never put that together as a kid. It was my uncle was the voice and puppeteer behind Iggy the Iguana, as well as a writer on many episodes. So growing up, that was just one of the CBC staples. But yeah, TVO, I remember watching as a kid, watching Polka Dot Door, that kind of stuff. But in modern times, I almost forget that TVO still has kids programming. Of course it does. Now that I think of it, I think a couple times before it was streaming everywhere. I remember watching Paw Patrol with my son on TVO or recording it off TVO. Anyways, Xavier Riddle, you can, if you're in the States, it's easier to find on PBS. If you're in Canada, it's on TVO. So in case you weren't exactly sure where to find it, that's where you do. Anyways, that's the TV series, but the books themselves are just an incredible series of books, and Brad Meltzer does a great job writing them, but obviously CHRIS is the amazingly talented cartoonist who's behind the really infectious visuals of the series. So again, I highly recommend that people pick up the books. I have a fair number of them. I have Walt Disney, I have Jackie Robinson, and a variety of others, but they're just a lot of fun to be able to kind of share with my children, and I really recommend people try them. And, to be honest, they're just charming books, regardless of how old you are. And I think I may have called it the wrong thing before, but it's Ordinary People Change the World is the name of the series. And again, in the TV show was Xavier Riddle and the Secret Museum. So sorry if I said that incorrectly earlier. Anyways, thank you for downloading this episode and for listening to this conversation with CHRIS. It was a tremendous pleasure to be able to chat with him. It's interesting, the connections as well, because obviously he works so much with Brad Meltzer, and Brad was the it's all connections, because then he was the college roommate of Jed Winnick, who's also a very good friend of the show, who was actually just on the last episode talking about the next Hilo book. So it's they're best friends, and then you have Brad and CHRIS working together, and there's a lot of connections there. So anyways, this was a lot of fun to do. We're actually going to be having an interview, hopefully in the next month, with someone else from the Virtual Calligraphy stable, talking about, lettering, and it's someone who's a little bit more modern entry into the business. So I'm actually really excited to talk with them. In terms of upcoming episodes, we've got some good stuff. We've got an episode coming up with Pat Olive and Chuck Austin talking about not just Edge World Series 2, which was originally originally our plan, but they just announced a couple days ago. I'm recording this on the 17th because this episode is late to air, but they just announced that they have a new Amazon or Comixology Originals series coming out, with the first issue actually dropping on Tuesday, the 19th of March. So I'm going to be talking with them that day. So it'll be a very fresh conversation, and that'll come out on Saturday, the 23rd. The 30th of March, we're going to have the next Book of the Month Club, this time looking at the first probably 3 months or so of the Clone Saga. The Clone Saga everyone thinks of when you mention Clone Saga for Spider-Man in the 90s. And then other episodes coming up include episodes with Joe Rubinstein. We have an episode coming up with Jan DeMatteis. We have the letterer who I haven't confirmed totally yet, but we're going to be having a letterer from the virtual calligraphy stable. And I think we're going to have, I'm trying to think. I think Mark Russell is going to be doing the show, so some good stuff. We're almost scheduled up to May, I should say already. So very good stuff coming up soon on Comic Shenanigans, and we might have an emergency episode in a couple days talking about X-Men '97. Anyways, thanks so much for listening, and let's jump right into the episode with Chris Eliopoulos. Enjoy. Chris, welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast.
Thank you so much.
I'm very excited to have you on. But I guess before we get into your amazing career in comics, I guess we should start way back at the beginning. When did you first experience comics?
So when I was really, really young, I got to say somewhere in the 6, 7 range, my father every Sunday would take my sister and I to like the local corner drugstore, whatever you want to call it, and he'd say, okay, he'd get his newspaper or whatever, and he'd say to my sister and me, get whatever you want. My sister would get like a candy bar, which would be gone before we were out of the store, and I would just pick up a comic book. At the time, it was like JLA or Flash, or they'd had like the crossover, it was like Flash and Green Lantern. And I still literally have those comics in my studio right now. So they got me early. I did stop for a while. Like I sort of soon after discovered Peanuts, the comic strip, and that like hit it for me. Like there was something in that. So I sort of switched over to comic strips. And then in high school, a friend reintroduced me to John Byrne comics, and that was it for me. So I was back in the game.
When it comes to, kind of cartooning, I mean, obviously when we look at your cartooning, it's easy to kind of see a bit of a Peanuts vibe. What were your other kind of influences that kind of prompted your own cartoon career?
Yeah, definitely Peanuts. There was Pogo when I was younger as well. When Calvin and Hobbes came along, it definitely hit me at the right time. It was like so many you probably don't remember, but so many comic strips at that time were just so poorly drawn and just sort of quick gag a day stuff, and it was just not interesting. And to the point where I was like, as a high schooler or middle school, whatever it was, I was going like, look, if I can draw better than this already, I can do this. And then Bill came along and just like sort of went, no, you might have to be really much better. And so he was a big influence, but there's been other things all over the years. John Byrne comics have been a big thing. Bloom County, The Far Side was a big thing for me. But mostly like when I was in high school for the comic book side, it was a lot of John Byrne stuff, Art Adams, Walt Simonson. And then when Eric Larson came along, I was a fan of his before we became friends. So, I sort of pull things from all of those different inspirations to do my work today.
At what point, I mean, everyone always has their own kind of moment when they're like, I want to work in this business. But I guess it's interesting, obviously, because a lot of people would have known you initially for being a letterer. So I'm curious, At what point were you like, I got to get into the industry? And was there any kind of discussion in your mind about like how you would be in the industry or what you would do? Or like lettering is a very interesting job and art. And I will admit to being a bit of a very naive until relatively recently, where
I was having a conversation with Richard Starkings, and I think that was the first person where I really kind of sat down and was like, oh my God, there's so much art in here without really realizing it. And I've read comics for forever, and I'm ashamed to say that, like, I talked to letters before and I knew it was an art, but I think it was Richard who really opened my eyes to really understand the artistry that's there. So I'm curious how you have felt about working in what is sadly a very underappreciated avenue of comics.
Yeah. Well, it started the idea that you could work in comics. So when I was little, what got me into Peanuts was my uncle owned it was like a remainder book company. So they would get like leftover print runs of books that the publishers couldn't sell. He would buy them really, really cheap, and then he'd resell them to libraries and schools and bookstores. And my parents would go on there on Saturdays to help him out into the warehouse. And like, this is talk about a different time. They would bring their 7-year-old kid with them, 8-year-old kid with them into this giant working warehouse where trucks going by and cherry pickers are coming by, and you're just like this tiny little thing. But they had these giant metal bins. They're almost like a little cage. And it was filled with books, and like Scrooge McDuck, I would just climb in and lay on it like it was gold coins. I would just pick out books and I would read. And one day I found the Peanuts books, these little faucet pocket books, and I just started reading them. And I would take them home. Again, they are in my studio right now. But I found this one book. The cover was ripped off. It was kind of destroyed a bit, but it was titled Charlie Brown and Charles Schultz, and it was sort of like there was a section on how he became a cartoonist, what his life was like as a kid, and it reminded me of me. And then I saw this section where it was Charles Schultz at his drawing table doing the work. And, as a kid, you realize that somebody's doing this, but as soon as I saw it, I realized, oh my God, you can get a career doing this. Like, you can have a living, you can get a job doing this. So I kind of basically told my parents I want to be a cartoonist when I grow up. And, they were just like, yeah, sure. That's like being an astronaut or whatever. The parents are just like, yeah, sure. So that was sort of like the goal. And then when I went to college, my parents, I had still wanted to be a cartoonist. And they said, well, that's great, but not many people make money doing that. Why don't you pick a career similar to that, adjacent to it? And so I chose a graphic design and advertising with a minor in illustration. And so what I did was I would sort of take night class. I wanted to take sequential. I wanted to take cartooning. So I had to find the cartooning classes at night or life drawing classes, anything that would help me on that side of the career for my minor. And then one day I was able to get a class. It was sequential storytelling, and the teacher was Gene Colan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and again, I had no clue at that point. I had sort of fallen out of comics again. In my high school period of time, I had a friend who was big into it. He got me into it. We were into it together, and then I went off to college, and I sort of dropped them because I had too much else going on. Mm-hmm. And when I got into this class, I didn't really know who Gene Colan was. I sort of knew the name, but I was like, I don't know really how big of a name he was. And right as I started the class, it was my final semester coming up, and we were told we had to get an internship just as he was taking us on a field trip to Marvel. And so I was able to go up to Marvel on a field trip. I asked who I could talk to about an internship. I talked to Suzanne Gaffney, who was Tom DeFalco's secretary or his assistant. Mm-hmm. And they asked me to come back in because they needed college interns. I came in and they said, bring your portfolio with you. And I brought all of the stuff I did in college, which is graphic design, production work, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And they were freaking out because most kids just show up with superhero pages drawn like a penciler would do. And they were like, oh, we've got somebody who knows the business. And so they asked me to come on and be an intern. And I split my time between editorial and production. And within the first 2 weeks, they were giving me freelance. And I said, oh, I can work in this business. Even though I don't want to necessarily be in comic books, I want to, be in this type of industry. And this is as good as a place as any. And so I basically started doing freelance. And then they hired me right out of college.
Wow. So what year was this exactly?
1989.
Wow. So working in the production offices, again, like, and also doing freelance. When you start doing that first freelance work, what freelance work are you actually doing, and at what point is it lettering?
So when I first came in, I showed my portfolio. And they brought me over to the production department, and Ken Lopez was the head lettering guy. And they looked at my stuff, and they kind of pointed at me and said, "You're going to be a letterer someday." And I was just like, I have no clue what that is. Like like most people, I was like, I do what now? But the one thing that stuck in my head, again, it goes back to Schultz, is I loved learning about him. And I knew that when he first got out of school and was actually still in school, he was taking on jobs as a letterer. Before he started Peanuts and all that stuff, he was lettering. So I said, well, if Schultz can do it, I can do it. And so, but my first job there was doing production work. So back in the old days, back before when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, what they would do is, if a book was running late, instead of normally the process would be penciled, then the letterer would letter on the boards, the inker would ink it, and it would go in, and the colorist would color on a Xerox copy and put the number codes for each thing. What would happen when they were late, they would send the pencil straight to the inker who would ink it, and then the letterer would take a copy, a full-size photostat or Xerox, whatever, of the page and letter on a piece of vellum over it. And then they would take that vellum, it would go into production, and they would white the back of it out with this like white gesso paint or whatever it was. And then you'd take rubber cement, you would cut out each individual balloon or sound effect, and you'd paste it onto the page. And so I had done stuff like that. I had done paste up in college. So like I already had a working knowledge of it, and they could see I could do that. And they basically, within 2 weeks, one night they were like, "We're running late. Can you take this issue of Excalibur drawn by Alan Davis and lettered by Tom Warzakowski and paste it up overnight?" And so I went home and did that. They trusted this stupid intern that I had just met to take these beautiful pieces of art and this wonderful lettering and just go home with it. And I did. And I came back the next day and dropped it off. And I want to say at the time they were paying something like $10 a page for paste up. So it was like, wow, look at this. I'm making money already. So that was sort of the beginning of the beginning.
Why do you think they immediately were kind of looking at you and saying, you're going to be a letterer someday? Was there something about you or the craft that you knew and your background with, in school? Or what was that? That's an interesting thing to say to someone.
Yeah, it was the portfolio. A lot of it was type design. Like I had taken classes in type design, which is not something they normally get at Marvel. Marvel is usually, it's everybody wants to be a penciler or an inker or a writer. And so those are the disciplines you get. And then you get somebody who walks in the door and says, I understand typography. They go, well, then you have to be, we need letterers. Like, you got to remember, like right after this, like 91, the boom kicked in, right? So there was they were printing anything. They were hiring everybody. I was lettering so much, it was ridiculous because they just couldn't keep up. They were just trying to sell everything. So they saw me walking in the door with this portfolio of like graphic design and, doing ad designs and doing newspaper designs and magazine designs. And they'd be like, oh, you understand this. So we're going to gear you. So, and even as I was doing production work, they would hand me all the materials I needed. They would send me there'd be samples of lettering. They would give me vellum. They gave me pens. They gave me ink. They sat me down and showed me how to like file down a Hunt 107 to get a wedge on it so that you could letter. And every day I would go in, I would work in the morning production doing paste up. I'd go downstairs, get a sandwich, and then over lunch I would practice lettering every day. And so once I graduated, they hired me on staff in production. And I want to say with only a few months, I think Kenny left and they needed a replacement, and they offered me his slot. So I got into the lettering department, which was basically doing lettering corrections on other letterers' stuff. So you had to match everybody's style and sort of make, fix up any errors, any misspellings, or if something needed to be tweaked a little bit. I would do that. So I spent a lot of time learning how other people lettered and lettered like them, which got me better. And then they started giving me freelance lettering work. So I would take, pages home and letter at night, and then come back in the next morning, drop them off, and go back to my day job.
So besides the fact that obviously like you're making money at this, and the work's pretty steady, because as you said, during the boom, like Marvel's publishing everything.
Yeah.
Anything they can possibly put out the door, they will. So there's a lot of work to go around. I'm curious first, with your, as you said, that you're kind of learning the craft and you're learning to letter, who were the influences, or who were the other letterers that you kind of looked to and said like that's the style that I like? Or was it even that simple for you? Or is it just more assimilating a little bit of everyone?
Yeah, a little bit. I will say there was a core group of guys, and the way we looked at it was sort of like it was like a family tree of letterers. You have your Tom Warzakowskis, you have your Todd Kleins, who sort of go in a different route and a different style. I went by the top guy was Jim Novak, who had lettered a bunch of comics in the 70s and 80s. He's famous for doing like redoing the Star Wars logo, the one that they used in the movie. Like he did it for the comic book, and then they said, "Oh, that's much better than the one we had," and they sort of adapted it and put it onto the movie. But he was a great letterer with a Hunt 107, and then like below, and then sort of alongside, but there was like Phil Felix, and then below that was Bill Oakley, Ken Lopez, Mike Heisler, and Pat Brosseau. And so they were like the guys I looked to. And so Kenny was the first guy that kind of took me under his wing and trained me. Then Mike Heisler did. And then Jim Novak and I would talk all the time. Bill Oakley and I would talk all the time. And so I sort of really fell under their sway. Like I learned talking to them what the right way to do lettering is according to that style. So those guys were my guys. As I went along, I learned, Tom Orrs and Todd Klein and John Workman. And I was like, oh, you could also do this other stuff. But I felt like this was the main discipline. And then if I needed to veer off once in a while, I would do that as well. But those were my key guys.
Before I get too far into the lettering, I'm curious, just because obviously so far Schultz has played a pretty big part in your mind of kind of your direction and why you even were like, okay, well, he did lettering, I can do the lettering too. Yeah. I'm curious, did you ever get to meet him?
Never met him. Although I will say this past year, I got invited out. They were the Schultz Museum in San Francisco, which is a beautiful place. They were doing an exhibit on Schultz's influences on others. And one of the influences they spotted was, since you noticed too, was the TV show we do, which is called Xavier Riddle and the Secret Museum. And they asked if they could have a clip of the show to run in the exhibit. And we said, of course, yeah. And, do you need anything else? And they said, well, we'd really love to have an original of Chris's in there. So I drew up a watercolor of our characters and then like Snoopy and Woodstock. And they framed it and hung it up in the exhibit next to a Schultz on one side and a Watterson, Calvin and Hobbes on the other. And then they invited me to come out and do an event at the museum. And so while I was there, his widow, Jeannie, was there. And she sat through my talk and then was like, hey, do you want to go see his studio? So at the time, my friend Judd Winnick, who is another wonderful cartoonist, lives nearby, and he had come up to hang out with us. And so we all went over to Schultz's studio, sat at his desk, took pictures like crazy, got to chat with Jeannie a lot. I got to go into like the archive, which is like a big room, it's like a temperature controlled room with safes in there where they have the original artwork, and they took some out to show me. It was like pure bliss. But so I never got to meet him though.
Okay, that still sounds like a tremendous experience, though.
Yeah,
I know. Judd has said like obviously he got to meet him, and that it felt weird to call him Sparky.
I can only imagine. I sometimes I feel better not having met him in a way, like because I don't know if they ever really meet up with what you expect them to be. Mm-hmm. Like I got to meet Burke Breathed at a convention, a New York convention. I was signing right after he was signing in a booth, and we chatted for a bit. And he was I had heard that he was like a bit curmudgeonly, but he was really, really nice. So like that one surprised me. But I'm always afraid that he would not live up to what I thought. I mean, I would even say John Byrne too. I met him, and I sort of knew him, side like through other people. Like, I became good friends with Terry Austin and Walt Simonson, and so they sort of are good friends with John. So there was definitely a connection, but I never met him before, and I heard horror stories about him, but he was a delight. So, maybe if I met Schultz, he would have been more than I expected, but I think I'm kind of glad that I sort of never did, because he'll live in that spot in my head for the rest of my life.
For sure. So going back to the early 90s, I'm curious, when did you and Eric Larson first become friends? Because obviously you were a big part of his Savage Dragon, especially in the first 100 issues, hand lettering that book. So, I mean, that's given that, he's leaving Marvel, he's doing his own thing. At what point did you kind of become involved with him? I think you'd already lettered his Spider-Man, I think, when he was doing Ejectiveless, but I could be wrong there.
Yeah, so he got asked to do fill-in one on Adjectiveless Spider-Man, and for some reason, at the time, like I said, things were starting to really pick up, and sometimes people couldn't handle all the work, and so it would get sent to somebody else. And I don't know if Rick Parker was doing that book, and they asked me to do the book, and so it was I think it was Spider-Man 15, something like that. It was the Beast was on the cover and in the book. And when I lettered it, I kind of asked him what he wanted, and I saw that he liked that workman style that him and Walt were doing, and so I started to do. He wanted to do. He goes, "I'm going to do the sound effects." I'm like, "All right," and then I started to do them on a separate piece of paper, like workman, and I would fax it to him and say, "Is this what you're looking for? What are you looking for?" And he's like, "I never had somebody ask me what I want." He goes, "I was so used to people just giving me whatever they wanted, and I wasn't happy with it." And so when he took over the book regularly, he asked that I letter the book. And again, with scheduling, I couldn't do the first one of, I think it was the Sinister Six, Return of Sinister Six one. I couldn't do the first one, but I did the rest. Or maybe I did the first one and it's not the second, whatever. One of them I didn't do. But I kept working with him and trying to give him what he liked. And sometimes, and then what he would do is I would send him the sound effect, he would approve it, and then I would draw it on the boards. Then I would put it down on the boards and then send it back. So he kind of liked our process where I was giving him what he wanted. And then we became like friends as we were working. If you remember, at some point during that, his house burned down.
That's right, yeah.
And so it was a big mess. And so we sort of became really good friends because we were talking all day long, every day, to the point where our wives were like, "Guys, like, you talk to each other more than you talk to us." But I was probably one of the first few people outside of the original 7 and their spouses or whatever who knew about the Image thing. Like, Eric was on the phone and goes, "Hey, listen, you're like the 5th person to know this. We're me, Jim, Rob, Mark, Wills, we're all going to go off, and Rob, and we're going to go off and make this new company. We're going to do our own books. I want you to letter my books." He goes, "You can't tell anybody about it, but this is what's going on." So, like, I was one of the first people to know. And but then we would talk about it, and then we did the first 3-issue limited, and then he's like, "Let's go. We're going to do this full time now." I said, "Okay." So it was good because, like I said, we became really good friends over that period of time where we worked together and would just chat all day long. It was ridiculous. So,
what were your impressions when you hear of this Image exodus? Like, again, it's hush hush. You're one of the first people outside this, that original circle to find out. What was your thought process at that time?
Originally, it was just, oh, good, more work for me. But yeah, because I was so new into the business, I didn't understand the impact. It was very interesting because all of the stuff you hear about and you read about and you see them, like I dealt with it in real time. Like, I dealt with, hearing the stories of, when they went into Marvel, or I hear the story, I talked to Rob, or I talked to Todd. Like, I mean, like, I literally, like, Todd was trying to come up with a logo for Spawn, and Eric's like, "Oh, you should talk to Chris. He could do a really good one." So I literally got on the phone with Todd and listened for 2 hours. Like, I literally think I said hello and goodbye in that conversation, the famous 2-hour Todd calls. And so I was getting all of this info as it was happening. And then I was also getting the stuff on the other side where, at the time, Marvel was like blacklisting all of the artists, and anybody that went to work for them, they were basically telling everybody they're not going to get hired. So I got really nervous and like, well, am I going to lose all my Marvel work for this one Image book? And so I talked to an editor. I forget who I talked to. And they said, yeah, we don't care about letters. I was like,
wow.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't really – we don't care. That doesn't matter. You can do as much work as you can do. They were more worried about writers, artists, inkers, colorists, doing that kind of stuff. So but yeah, like I wasn't fully aware of the impact at the time until things got like really – like it blew up. Eric and Mark were going to a convention in Detroit. And Eric's like, well, this is the first time we had never met in person. We'd always talked on the phone. And he said, basically, part of the deal of me coming is if you bring Chris. So I had to go on the guest list, and they flew me out and they put me up. And we met up, and I went back to his room. We were chatting, and like somebody came to the door looking for him to sign stuff. People were calling our hotel room. We went down to the lobby to have dinner. And we saw these two guys come sit down right next to us, and you could tell they were just listening to our conversation. It was really weird. And then we went to the show, and they put us all in this separate room, and people were just filing through. It really was like the Beatles are signing here. And I remember I went to go get us something to drink, and I came back, and this kid was holding like a Savage Dragon under his arm, with like a poly bag in front of him, throwing up into the bag because he was like so excited to meet them. And I went, oh God, this is really, really big. Jim Lee went on a tour. I was doing some work for Jim at one point. I was lettering Wildcats and a few other things. And he came on a tour of the East Coast, like on a bus. A bunch of them came out, and he was coming to the comic shop near me. And so he's like, oh, come on out. And I went out and met up with them, and it was pandemonium. Like, it was crazy in the beginning. It eventually died down, obviously, but in those beginning few, like that first year was insane. It was just crazy. But I mean, by that point, I was already lettering like all the big books. I had taken over like X-Men and everything that was the top seller. They were sort of throwing my way all of a sudden. So I was sort of used to this level of craziness of being seen a lot, but not being really cared about because I was just a letterer. But it was definitely a fun time for them. I mean, these guys were making money hand over fist. It was like incredible. They were generous to a fault in terms of paying. They were doing much better than the big two, which was nice. So like, I mean, thanks to Jim and Mark, I bought my first house for a book I lettered overnight. So.
Wow.
It was like, we're late. We need you to letter this overnight. We'll give you your page rate and 1% of the take. And it was like that. Is it Deathmate? Is that the name of with Valiant? It was a crossover.
Oh, yeah. I don't remember the exact name, but I know what you're talking about.
Deathmate or Deathmatch, something, one of those two. And so I lettered overnight, and I made like something like $14,000-$15,000 just for – and this is like $91, $92. So like, it's insane. Or $94, whatever it was. But yeah, so like they really took care of us, at the time. So it was a blast. It was a good time.
Did it, when this was happening, and again, with as much product was starting to be published, did it feel at the time like it was going to be a bubble that was going to burst? Like, what did it feel like being inside?
No, it felt like this is the start of something new and big. Like, it felt like, I mean, you got to remember, they became the second largest publisher for a while. Like they pushed past DC, like, which is insane. But but you're in the middle of it and you're just trying to keep up. Like, they were going crazy. Like, something similar happened to me later, but they went from just freelance drawing books to having to become business owners and having to deal with payments and, copyrights and dealing with lawyers and all that kind of stuff. And it becomes overwhelming at first. So at the time, everybody is struggling to keep their heads above water. and nobody sees that part of it. They go, oh, they're just lazy. They didn't get these books out. But, like they're trying to figure out how to do 1099 forms for these people they're now hiring. They have to buy, and Jim and Mark and Rob, in their case, they had to, rent spaces to have like people work. And, it's not something we're definitely brought up to figure out. We're not businessmen. And so they, had to have a crash course in figuring that out. So really it was just, for me anyway, I was doing a bunch of their books, but I was doing Marvel work, DC work, Valiant work. I was sort of doing it all, and watching them kind of try and stay on top of it. I don't think we thought it was ever going to be anything but big, like all the way through. It was going to be the new norm. Mm-hmm. So, but we had thought that about the whole industry. We didn't count on like 5 years later, 4 years later, that, the whole thing would collapse. And so many of these people that they were hiring to publish everything were now out of the business. So it'll humble you, this business.
I guess at that point, I mean, as you said, like you were lettering enough bigger books for Marvel that I guess when the overall line starts to contract, you probably didn't feel necessarily that in danger. I say, relatively speaking. Obviously, they went through a bankruptcy, so that's going to be scary regardless. Yeah.
Well, what was interesting, too, was also at the time going on when I was still on staff. So I was still on staff until like 91. Mm-hmm. Richard had just introduced the idea of computer lettering. And he had sent in a book that they had lettered on the computer. It was on overlays. They sent it in to do paste up. And unfortunately, so many people looked at it and said, this is not going to last. Everybody's going to want it hand lettered. I saw the writing on the wall immediately. And I went and contacted a guy to create a font for me as I was moving forward with my career. And so by the time I got out and was going freelance, I was still lettering by hand, but I knew we were shifting to computer lettering. And so, but what happened was Richard started to take all of the work. People found, oh, you guys can get 4 guys to letter a book in half a day, and it saves us, you got to remember, by hand, most people could do about 10 pages a day. I got to the point where I was doing almost 20 pages a day. I was almost doing a full book a day. Wow. I actually did at one point when I was still hand lettering. I was doing 30 books a month for a few months, which is insane. I know. But most people couldn't do that. And so the editors were like, well, this is great. It all looks the same. Even if I got 4 guys working on it, we get it done in a day and the book goes out. It's great. And so he started to take up a lot of the work, and they were giving him a lot of work, and he was hiring people. And so the rest of us were losing work. So just perfect timing, just the year like 99 when my kids were born, I had my worst year financially when it came to this stuff. Like you said, so many books were getting canceled. The other books are getting lettered by computers, by Richard and his crew. So I was sort of thinking I might be out of this business at that point. Luckily enough, I had enough work. It got better the next year. And then like in 2002, Marvel asked me to take over like the lettering for them. So it kind of came back. But yeah, there was a point where it was like, ooh, I might be out.
At what point do you create virtual calligraphy?
So what happened was,
I guess I should say for those who are listening, like this is, you creating basically your own like lettering. I want to call it like a studio, essentially.
Yeah, pretty much, right.
Kind of like your version of Comic Craft, I guess.
Yeah. I had no plans of doing that. I didn't want to do it. I was very happy to just sit and letter stuff on my own and not create a company and not do anything like that. But I think at the time, it was a double-edged sword for Richard. He could get things done. He got them done fast. And then, he started charging for things, which, they would come back with corrections and say, we want this changed. And he said, well, then we're going to have to charge you. We want you to, whatever. I don't remember all the things. But so I think it was getting kind of expensive. And Marvel was like, we just went through bankruptcy. We can't afford this anymore. And so they said that. So Bill Jemis decided that he wanted to have an in-house lettering department. So he was going to have everybody letter in-house. And so he contacted me and said, would you like to come on and sort of head this up? And I said, no, I don't want to come into the office. I don't want to do anything like that. I don't want to be back in the business that way. And he was persistent. He kept saying, like, how about we get you to come in like once a week? You talk to the guys, you train them, you show them what's good and bad, and and then they were going to license my fonts. And I said, that's fine. I can do that. And then they said, well, we'll guarantee a certain amount of work for you. And I said, oh, that's great. So they gave me a certain amount of work, and then I would go in and I would basically train these guys how to letter. But I warned him that when you're on staff, you get paid a flat rate. And I said, these guys don't have incentive to get things done quickly, or even work during the day. Like, they could not go very fast during the day and then work at night and get overtime. And I said, so you're not going to get things done as quickly as you want them. And he's like, no, we'll get it done. We'll get it done. I said, all right. So we went a couple of months, and it happened that way. Like, they weren't getting enough work done, and they were getting frustrated. And literally, like, the one day I showed up, Bill asked me to come into his office and sat me down with a couple other people on staff, like the head of production and an operations guy, and said, say, here's the deal. We want you to take over all of the lettering starting like this week. And I went, whoa, what happens to the guys that are on staff? And he goes, oh, they're fired. Whoa. And I said, oh, no. I said, okay, wait, how about this? If I hire them, is that okay? Would you be willing to go with that? He's like, I don't care what you do. They are fired no matter what. And I went, oh, okay. And literally, I had to. They're like, okay, you're going to go tell them. And I was like, what? So I literally had to go down with the head of production into the meeting with all the lettering guys, out of the blue, say, there's bad news and good news. I'm like, the bad news is you're fired. They're firing you. The good news, I'd love to have you come work with me. You'll get a page rate. You can get as much work as you want. We'll keep things going. I think there were 4 guys there at the time. One guy said, F all of you, and walked out. 2 other guys were like, we're in. The third was like, I'm sort of in, but I want to do other work as well. And I was like, all right, whatever. I mean, okay. So within a week, I had to then take on all of the Marvel books. I had to create a company. I had to set up the whole thing, like just like Image had to do. All these guys, I had to set up a business. I had to set up, a payment structure. I had to set up, get to all the guys' information so that I could pay them properly. I had to, set up a thing with Marvel where we get paid. I had to set up everything all at once. The only thing I did different from Richard was they became subcontractors.
Okay.
And they worked out of their own homes. So there was no studio to pay for, so I didn't have to worry about the overhead costs. I basically would pass the money along to them, take a piece for myself, and then sort of keep it as like sort of a subcontracting situation. So it's not they don't technically work for me. They work as a subcontractor for me. So, but yeah, that was the first time I had a panic attack. Literally, we had just bought a new house, so we had to do that. We had just gone through all the closing, and then this kicked in. I had to create a company and do all this stuff. So it was all at once, and it was pretty nerve-wracking, scary.
What was Jemis's, like, if you hadn't, like, how, I guess I'm trying to understand from his perspective, like,
yeah,
fires all these guys, you're going to be doing it all now. How does he think you're going to do that without, I guess, hiring all these people back to basically subcontract? Like, it just sounds so bizarre.
He literally did not care. He just, it was weird. He's definitely a weird soul. He was always very nice to me. I don't know if it was 2 things. He's Greek, I'm Greek, so maybe he had the Greek connection. Sometimes Greeks are like that. But the other thing is, he asked me to come on as art director, and I said no. I didn't want to come back to the city every day. I did it while I was, working there. I did it when I was in college. I had my kids. They were little. They were at home. I liked being home with my family. And I said no. And so he's like, how about you come in 3 days a week? And I'm like, no. And he's like, how about 1 day a week? And I'm like, no. He's like, 1 every day, every other week. And I'm like, Bill, I don't want to be art director. I don't want to be in charge of all of this stuff. It's too much. I just want to be. He goes, see, that's the thing. All the good ones know they shouldn't work on staff at Marvel. And I was like, oh God, that's like an awful thing to say. And not true, by the way. Some people just like being on staff. It's just a different lifestyle I just preferred to be at home. So I think he felt like I was somebody that could just get the job done. Mm-hmm. And so he's like, just do it. He's like, I don't care how you do it. Just do it. And so I did. And, luckily enough, my wife was supportive. But yeah, I don't know properly what he thought. I think he was definitely of the just make it happen kind of leaders. Like, mm-hmm. I think, with Joe, he was just like, get it done, do whatever. I don't care. Just do it. Whatever it takes.
That does seem to jive with most stories I've heard about the man, that, he was, just when he had to be in his bonnet, it just had to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Whatever that was.
Yeah. Yeah. He would make a snap decision, and that was the decision. I mean, I think, maybe at the time when they were coming out of bankruptcy, you needed somebody like that to just sort of like just make a decision and go on to the next thing. Luckily enough, he was smart enough to have Joe in the mix, who knew comics and could sort of steer things a bit well. Tom Brevoort was there. Ralph Macchio was there. You had these people who have been around a long time that could keep the ball rolling and knew the business, and he could just say, take care of it, and they would know what to do. I guess he felt the same way with me. And that's what I did. And luckily enough, knock wood, it worked out well, and we're still working with them. So
for sure. So one question I have, and this isn't something you started, but I'm curious what your thought is as a letterer, is mm-hmm. When you start lettering, I think it was Ultimates, and eventually took on a lot of the Ultimate books. Yeah. How did you feel about the lowercase font, or the lowercase mixed case use of dialogue and words, as opposed to the classic all caps?
Yeah. Yeah, that one again was Bill. So when I agreed to train the lettering guys, and they said they wanted to give me a bunch of books, the first book they gave me was Ultimates. And Bill had said, why is everything all uppercase? All books are upper and lowercase. We should do them upper and lowercase. So I set out and explained to him, Bill, here's the reason behind this. So the printing process in years past was so poor that letters would drop out. So you had to keep them all upper and lowercase. It saves space. There's very little kerning, little line spacing between. It tightens everything up so you're not taking up more of the page. I don't care. It looks like we're childish. Let's do upper and lowercase. So part of that whole deal is I had to go home and then create a whole new font, upper and lowercase, which is a whole new set of parameters and problems that I had to figure out as I was going. Like, you got ascenders and descenders, and what if this bumps into the line above or below, and what works with it. It was like a whole nightmare. I was never really a fan of it because I'm sort of the traditionalist, and I like the way it looked beforehand. I understand what he was saying, but and I created a font where I felt it was close enough to almost like a type font as opposed to a hand lettering font, that it sort of worked. But some people love it. I'm not a fan of it. I will use it when we're asked to use it, but the first chance as soon as Bill was gone, you'll notice everything went back right up to uppercase. I think Bill Dan Buckley had said right as he came in as the new publisher president, he just was like, we're going back to uppercase, folks. So he was back up. But to this day, some people prefer the upper lowercase, and we'll do it. But it's not my preferred method of lettering books.
Now, I know we're already, somehow already 45 minutes in, and I haven't talked about your amazing Ordinary People Change the World series, so I am remiss. I feel like I should change.
No, we can keep going. Go, wherever you want. I'm fine. I'm not going anywhere.
Okay. Well, I have a few. I was looking over all the books you did in the 90s, and there's some particular ones I just wanted kind of quick hits or some ideas of what it was like to work on those. You worked on a lot of Star Trek books.
Yes.
And I'm curious what it was like lettering those, because I would imagine that is a different feel than your regular book.
Yeah. Yeah, it was weird. I think I've lettered for both Marvel and DC. I don't remember. I also did. I think I did Dark Horse too. I did a little something for Dark Horse. I think I actually wrote and drew a couple of Star Wars tales for them. I didn't do Trek for them, but I did Star Wars tales. Yeah, so I did Trek for DC, Marvel. I think DC, right? I don't know. You probably have if you have the credits for. I can't even remember at this point.
It wasn't DC first, and then Marvel got the license back, and then they did them for a number of years, and you did a bunch of those. Like one of the series you did, Star Trek Untold Voyages. I actually just did a deep dive with the writer Glenn Greenberg about a month ago. Actually, the episode just went up 2 days ago as we speak. But so that one's top of mind. So I just saw your work on that one.
Well, as a Star Trek fan, it was like so much fun to do. Like I got a kick out of it. I even did recently. IDW did the 400th issue of Star Trek, and Heather got me to write the first story in that one. So
that's awesome.
I'm always like trekking, trekking and warsing. But yeah, no, that stuff was fun. Like, again, that was I think one of the first times Marvel let me letter on computer for their book, so which is great. And Tim Toohey was the editor, and he was like a pal and really cool with everything. So it made life a lot easier.
When did you meet Judd Winnick? Because I know you worked in Adventures of Barry Ween, so I'm curious when you guys actually met. We
met at a San Diego Comic-Con. Now I knew of him. It's funny. I knew of him because he had a comic strip called Frumpy the Clown, and I was always into comic strips. It was only later that I discovered that he was on when I met him, I discovered that he was on a TV show called The Real World on MTV years ago. So when I met him, I was talking comic strips, and as we're talking, people kept coming up and asking for his autograph. I'm like, how do so many people know Frumpy the Clown? And he kind of laughed at me, and he goes, "Oh no, I was on a TV show." And I was like, "Wait, what now?" So I got that info. So we met fairly early, so probably early Image days, and he said, I'm trying to shop around this thing called Barry Ween. And I took a look at it, and I said, not for nothing, I'm really good friends with one of the owners of the company at Image. Eric had said to me, anytime you want anything published, you can publish it. That was sort of like the fun thing of knowing an owner and being good friends with him. And he's like, well, let me just shop it around first. Let me see if anybody else will buy it. And then I looked at it. I thought it was great. And then I don't think anybody really wanted to publish it. And so he's like, can you still get me in an Image? So I think I literally was on the phone with Eric, and I just went, hey, my pal Judd wants to do this book. And he goes, okay. And that was it. I was like, all right, Judd. And so I did the logo for him. I put the book together for him. I did all of the whatever the typesetting stuff. I did everything for him. Sent it off to Image. So we did the first series was basically me being his production manager. And as he was doing that, he was doing a book called Pedro and Me, a graphic novel about his time on the show with his friend Pedro, who sadly passed away from AIDS. And he'd said, I want you to letter it. And I said, no. He sent me the book before in pencil form. And I said, no. This is from you. You have to do everything. And he goes, well, I can't really letter. I want it to look good. And so I actually created a font based on his hand lettering and gave it to him and said, do it yourself, place it yourself, go nuts. So he did it. And then I had the book was wonderful. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's an amazing story.
We actually just did a Book of the Month club on it about a month ago with my wife.
There you go.
Because I've talked to Judd a lot of times over the years. He's been really generous with me every year. Whenever he has a new high-low book come out, I always have him on the show. So
awesome.
He's tremendous. And so I finally got my wife to read Pedro and Me. We just did that about a month ago. Yeah,
it's amazing. And so I gave it to my friend Mike Martz, who was editing the X-Men line at the time. And I said, you got to read this. He's really good. And he read the book, and he gave Judd Exiles at the time.
Yep.
Hired him to do that one. So, and then, he went off and he was writing Batman stuff and he sort of developed a name as a writer at that point, which was awesome. And we sort of lost touch over the years, whatever. And then, Brad and I hooked up, Meltzer and I hooked up, and at one point he's like, "Hey, can I give Judd your email?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, how do you know Judd? Like, did you meet him through comics, whatever?" He's like, "We were roommates in college." And I'm like, "What?" So I was like, "Of course, give him my email." And so we got back in touch, and we've been like thick as thieves ever since. So like literally, like we were chatting yesterday, like crazy. I mean, it's just he's a sweetheart. So that's how we met. We met at a Comic-Con of all things.
That's crazy. It's funny, when my wife read Pager and Me, I was like, the guy he says who's his friend Brad, that's the guy who writes the Ordinary People Change the World book. She's like, really? I'm like, yeah. Because it's such a small world.
Yes, I know, it's crazy. I know, it's just, I was like, what the, and like now, Judd is repped by my agent and Brad's agent. Like we sort of, it's like this round robin of things, and like it's weird. We were at New York Comic-Con a few years back, like 2015. And so I was at my desk, at my table with Eric. I had left to go wherever I was going. And I come back and Eric goes, "Hey, these two guys came looking for you." And I'm like, "Oh, really? Oh. Who were they?" And he's like, I don't know. And I said, "Oh, whatever." And then I went out to dinner with Judd and our agent Jody, and Judd was like, "Hey, did you talk to Seth and Shu today?" And I'm like, "Who?" He goes, "Seth Meyers and Mike Shoemaker. Like they said they stopped by your table." And I'm like, "No." And he's like, "Oh man." So at this point, Judd was head writer for their animated show.
Oh yeah.
And so we took a picture of me like crying that I missed him, and he was consoling me, and he texted it to them and said, "Chris is sorry he missed you," and all that stuff. So and then like a year later they asked me to come on the show. So it's like all this round robin inbred stuff. I have no clue what we're doing. We all know each other now for some reason.
Going back to my extensive list of notes.
Yeah.
Another a favorite era of mine, just because of the age I was at the time, is the Amalgam books. And you worked on two of those, and you also did the lettering on Green Lantern, Silver Surfer. I'm curious what it was like, just for you as someone who was a fan, who's now working in the industry, who's lettering on a book that's a crossover between two companies. Did that ever feel different when you're working on a project like that, or did it just feel like just another project, or did it feel different because you are dealing with editors from both companies?
I definitely remember it being kind of neat. I don't, again, you got to remember at the time, it's like I'm lettering everything under the sun. So it was like, to be honest with you, it was probably one day out of my life that I lettered an issue of a book. And so like, how do I, remember all that? I mean, I remember them coming out and being this interesting thing. I know some people were like, "Ooh, this isn't, this is not interesting at all." But at the time I was like with, good friends with Ron Marr, still friends with him, but like, like we were working together on Green Lantern and then Silver Surfer stuff. So it was sort of, a lot of times it came down to just enjoying working with the people that I'm friends with. And so for me, it's not necessarily like oh my God, I'm working on the another big crossover with Marvel and DC. It was like, oh, cool, these are guys I like working with. Let's get this done. So,
I'm curious.
Did Ron write that one? The Silver Surfer Green Lantern one?
I believe he did.
I was going to say, it sounds like it was in his wheelhouse. So
that absolutely is his wheelhouse.
Yeah.
In and around this period, you were also the, I guess, fairly regular letterer for What If. I'm curious. I mean, What If 105, which is the first appearance of Spider-Girl, is probably one of the most reprinted What If issues that they've ever done. Yeah. And again, I guess it was probably the same idea, like, oh, cool story, but like never thought that would be something that would become its own thing.
It's crazy. I just thought it was a one and out. Like, again, a lot of these books, it's funny. Like I had a backlog of a bunch of books, and I gave them to a friend who's selling them. He's just whatever. He's selling them for whatever. And the money he's getting on like because you would work on a book, you get a bunch of comps. So you get like 5 or 6 copies of a book. And like that issue was selling for hundreds of dollars. And I'm like, what the, you know, and then like, NYX and like the first, appearance of X23 and at the time, I was just like, Joe wanted me to letter the book. I lettered the book. and not thinking that these are these huge things. I mean, I know it's funny. I did the cover copy for, was it New Mutants 98? Is that the one with like Deadpool on the cover? And I did the cover copy, and I'm like, I forgot I did it. And then I saw the cover, and I went, oh, I did that when I was on staff. And I had taken all of the cover copy that I had drawn up at home after I left Marvel. So I found it, and I gave it to Rob at one of the conventions. He's like, oh my God, like, who knew, right? So he's got that now. You know, who knew that, you know, all these books, like, who knew that the last issue of Spider-Man that Todd did, I got the letter, became such a controversial thing. Like, at the time, you're just barreling through onto the next job. So you never really know how big these things will become.
For sure. Well, I guess you were the original letterer on X-Force as well, which, I mean, again, I guess when they launched that, they had an inkling that it was going to be big, maybe not as big as it was going to be. What was it like for you to be able to kind of start a book? Because again, at that time, you're running around, you're jumping in on, if it's a Barbie fashion book, you're lettering it, right?
Kid and play. I'm doing all the big stuff.
Exactly. But now you're actually like launching a book from the beginning. Did that feel different to you because you get to kind of create that visual style from the beginning in terms of the letters?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I remember I was sitting at my desk at Marvel. I was still on staff at that point. I had been making good money working, like, lettering books at night. I would work all day, go home at night, letter books until like 3 a.m, come back. I was making, at a point, making more money at home on nights and weekends than I was on staff. But I needed a certain amount of books, regular books, to know. And this was like the second to last that I needed. And I remember Bob just coming up, dropping like the thing on my desk and saying, okay, you're lettering X-Force now. And I'm like, okay, what's X-Force? Okay. And he's just like, New Mutants is ending. This is the new book. It's Liefeld. It's Fabian, Brad Van Cotta, and you. And I'm like, oh, great. Wonderful. And I remember we went out after work to one of the local bars or whatever, and it was like Fabian, who I think was still on staff at the time, me, and Brad was there, Van Cotta was there. And so we were like, everybody but Rob, and Bob Harris was with us. Everybody was there except for Rob. And we were like, yeah, here's the X-Force, woot. It was sort of like a thing. I do remember, like it was stupid stuff. Like, you're on staff and, Jim Lee comes in and, you're watching him doing a quick drawing in Bob's office, and you're like, that's crazy. And then Steve Ditko walks by handing in some work, and you're like, holy crap. Like, there he is. There's the guy, or you meet Stan Lee and chat with him for a few minutes. It's all kind of crazy. So, yeah. So, but with the X-Force, I don't think anybody thought it was going to be as big as it was. I know, obviously a lot of sales because of the cards being inside. So that kind of boosted, goosed the sales. But yeah, like, no idea. I mean, we knew after Todd's book that, it would be big because it was just a new #1. It was doing well. But I don't think anybody had any real inclination until sales numbers came in that it was going to be huge.
A question about, when you're lettering X-Force 2, you have Deadpool in there and he's talking. Yeah. In his first appearance, it's red around his text boxes, but starting in this issue, it's yellow. And obviously that ends up becoming a pretty big part of his speech pattern later. Yeah. I'm curious, was that your decision to change it to yellow from red? And if so, why?
Nope. Well, Brad probably colored it that way, whatever. Maybe he didn't see previous ones. I know Fabian wanted the idea of this double balloon, which of course takes takes up too much space. But it was sort of like the thing to make him sound like there was something wonky going on with his voice. That was the other thing. Like, Fabian started to do that, wanting me to do different style balloons for different people. Like, Farrell had a different balloon style, and I think it kind of got people going. And then when I was doing that, Bob Harris was like, I love what you're doing here. You sort of, some words are bigger and some are big, in the balloon. He's like, start doing, X-Men. And I took over X-Men, and I was doing it like that. So I think it probably was just an error in terms of Brad just not knowing what color it was supposed to be, or they decided maybe yellow works better. But yeah, you would have thought red with his red costume, but whatever.
I'll ask you a question I asked Richard, because Richard was obviously very much involved in this. Richard Starkings, of course, for those who aren't following along. So in the in the mid '90s, a lot of characters started having unique text bubbles. You'd have like Human Torch, his thing would be on fire. You had a character in Amazing Spider-Man named Delilah who had, specific words would be very different in terms of how it was lettered. I'm curious what you felt of that time, because he has kind of looked back and said that he thought that the writing should be good enough so that you know who's speaking and not because of the color of the bubble or because of the text. So I'm curious as a letterer what your interpretation was as that became more and more prevalent, that people wanted to have more and more kind of unique text for characters.
Yeah. So like I said, when I was doing it by hand, I would do a few things like that. And it just, I thought back to Pogo and how in some cases some of the characters would speak differently in different fonts or different balloon shapes or whatever. So I would do it here and there. But what happened is, in the 90s with the advent of the computer, right, for coloring and for lettering, everybody kind of goes through a learning curve, and part of the learning curve is just throwing everything at the wall and figuring out how it works. Like you saw all that garish color where people were just trying to figure out, like, let's do a purple to an orange fade in the lettering, and you're just like, whoa, and sort of, the lettering, I think, did that too. And I think a lot of editors were excited about, and writers were excited by it, and they were like, oh man, like we could have everybody in a different, and everybody speaks in a different kind of style. And then it just becomes like white noise, right? I mean, but Richard, of course, did great stuff. I mean, it was beautiful stuff. I think at some point we reached maximum overload and it was like time to cut back. And I agree. My first lesson when I learned from Jim Novak was, letterers are supposed to like be not noticed. Like if you're doing a good job, you don't get noticed. But then I'd also see John Workman and Tom Orzechowski and Todd Klein and say, oh, they're not doing that as much. And then Richard started doing it. And I'm like, well, it's going much beyond. But I think even he felt like he needed to pull back a little bit. But, sometimes you need somebody at the reins who says enough's enough. And I mean, I definitely, when Dan Buckley came on, he put his foot down. Besides the upper and lowercase, he was like, enough with everybody speaking in a different font and a different thing. Let's settle things down a little bit. You're not the stars of the show. Your name's not on the cover. Let it go. So, which was good. I think it was better to kind of go back to that. Let the writer and the artist tell the story. You don't need to, the way I equated it to was sort of like if you're watching a movie and the sound is too loud, it ruins the movie for you. So, in this case, let's tone it down. I don't mind having it once in a while, and certain characters, have something special going on. That's great. It kind of gives it a little something. But it's sort of like if you're always playing, at 8 decibels, 22,000 decibels, when is anything quiet? Like, so maybe just once in a while you make a loud noise with a font and a balloon style. So, but that's my take anyway.
As you say, like the more infrequently used, the more impactful it is when it's used, right?
Yeah, sure.
So going into the mid 2000s, I'm curious what the genesis of the Franklin Richards stories were, because I remember at the time, so I almost owe you an apology. I loved your work on it, but I remember at the time also being like, I was used to what we were getting from Marvel with like mini Marvels and that kind of stuff by Chris Caruso. And then suddenly I felt like that was, we kind of switched tacks and we kind of moved away from that. And then we got your amazing work on Franklin Richards, but it almost felt like the both of you didn't really get to do it at the same time. It was almost like there was a Chris Caruso period, and now there's a Chris Eliopoulos. Like only one Chris at a time can be doing cartooning of these characters. And I'm curious, one, if you ever felt that, and two, just in general, what was the genesis of you being able to do these books originally with Mark?
Yeah, so, well, I mean, Chris and I are buddies, so, but he was on staff at the time, and then much like when I was on staff at Marvel, they would have me do little cartoons in the backs of letter columns, or I did stuff in like Marvel Age or What the. They were great. They let me do that, and then sometimes they do that with people on staff. Like they'll give you little gigs to do like that here and there. I don't know if I remember so much. I mean, it's weird. I was doing my own book at Marvel at Image, the Desperate Time stuff out of Eric Savage Dragon, And so Chris and I were buddies. Like, I mean, they used to come out here. A bunch of people used to have like football games. It was like the Wizard people and like Marvel, DC people, editors, and whoever else, production people. We'd all get together and go play football. And Chris would come out and he'd come to my house and we'd hang out for a little bit and chat, and then we'd go play football. So like real buddies and stuff. I think that's why everybody thinks we're the same guy. Sometimes I get like, mini Marvels to sign. I'm like, sorry, not me. But I've been trying. Like I said, I was doing the Desperate Time stuff. I was trying to get more writing and drawing gigs. Like I had been lettering long enough. I had got the career going. I've got the company going. And I was getting to the point. My wife even said to me, why don't you just take a year off? Just work on your cartooning, because you're missing. Like you're lettering so much that you don't get to do the thing you love. And I was like, oh man, I don't know if I could do that. But I, was thinking about it. And Marvel was they were going to be doing a thing called, I think it was called Marvel Age. It was a line of kids books. And they were going to do like Power Pack and a few other specifically aimed at younger readers. And I had gone into the office. I had heard about it. I was sitting in C.B. Cebulski's office at the time. And I was like, oh man, if you're going to do a kids thing, I got this idea for a Franklin Richards book. And I basically just pitched him on the spot. It's Franklin and Herbie. And like I said, my kids get into my stuff all the time. At one point, my son was like shuffling along the carpet, and then he went and stepped on my Mac tower, and then my hand was on the keyboard, and he touched my shoulder, and it created a circuit and blew out my computer.
Oh no!
And I'm like, my kids get into all my stuff and break it. Can you imagine what Franklin's life would be like with a father who creates everything under the sun? Like, how could you not have fun with that? And like, I'm giving him this pitch, and like, he starts to make a phone call. And I'm like, geez, man, could you even let me finish before you make a phone call? But he had called up David Gabriel, who's the VP of sales now, and said, I have another book for our Marvel Age line. And so they were like, all right, we want you to do a book. And I was like, really? Wow. Okay. And then they got a little scared. And then they said, you know what? We don't trust you to do this alone. You've never done this before. I'm like, I've done it on my book. They're like, you haven't done a Marvel book. And I'm like, okay. So what do you want? And they were like, well, we're going to give you Mark Sumerak to script your book. You're gonna plot it, give him everything that you're doing, let him script it. And I'm like, that's fine. He goes, and then they were like, you know what? We're going to break it up into the back of Power Pack. We're not going to give you your own book yet. I'm like, oh, okay. And then we did it. We did the first limited series for Power Pack, and everybody loved the Franklin backup. So they said, we're going to make this a one-shot. You just have to do one more story. So I did another story. We put it together as a one-shot, and it sold well, and everybody really liked it. And they're like, let's do another one. And so I did that for a couple of years, all because I just happened to be in the right place at the right time.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
It was a really fun series of one-shots. Like, it was just madcap fun, and your art was just pitch perfect for it.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I had been saying for years that we kind of shifted our focus from kids to adults in comics, and especially the direct market. It's definitely towards the older crowd. And I said, we should get into bookstores. We should do all the stuff they're doing today is like the stuff I was saying in the early 90s, and everybody was like, you don't know what you're talking about. And what was interesting is then they did the Franklin stuff. They collected them as a trade, and it sold really well in bookstores. And they were like, oh, there's like a new market here. And then they, went off and did something else instead.
It's unfortunate.
Well, you know what it was is I still don't think a lot of the editorial and people, they gear their thoughts are for adult content, older, late teens, all the way up through 50 years old, 60 years old. Like that's who they're shooting for. And so they sort of outsource a lot of the kids stuff to other publishing units and stuff like that. So it's sort of just, it's fine. I just like that they're starting to reach out and going with Scholastic and a few other and getting out into bookstores and trying. But I was saying back in 92, come on guys, let's do this. So
what was like writing Lockjaw and the Pet Avengers? Like, did you pitch that one as well, or like how did that come about?
So Nate Cosby had liked my work, and it's funny. This is the Chris Giarrusso connection. He had asked Chris to do like a 6-page backup in Spider-Man Family, and Chris just locked up and couldn't figure out a story to do, and it was running late, and so Nate goes, "I need you to do a story," and so I wrote this 6-page story. It's basically this kid who's getting bullied meets the puppet master who creates this Spider-Man doll for him because he's so lonely. It gives him something to play with, and the Spider-Man doll sort of comes to life and sort of protects him and takes care of the bullies. And then at the end, and he just always says like the Spider-Man catchphrases, here, Wallop and Web Snappers from the TV show, and then at the end he's like, "Come on, let's go beat up the bullies now," and we'll be the bullies now. And then the Spider-Man doll says, "With great power, there must also come great responsibility," and it ties up. So I send it off to him, and he's like, "Wow, like you made me cry doing this story." Like he's like, "I can't believe, like I'm so used to being funny, silly stuff. I can't believe you wrote something like gets right to the center of Spider-Man, right into the like as a kid." And so he's like, "I want you to write and draw a Spider-Man lead story." And I'm like, "What now?" And he goes, what would you do? I said, "Oh man, I always loved Walt Simonson's Frog Thor." It's like, I would love to do, because it's supposed to be like an alternate version of Spider-Man, like not in continuity. So I said, "I'd love to retell that story as a Spider-Man story." He's like, "Do it." So I did a whole thing. I wrote and drew it. I mean, I was not ready to do this, but I did it. He loved it. And then when I finished it, he goes, I was in the office, and he calls me into his office. He goes, "Okay, the animals of the Marvel Universe, write me a pitch." And I'm like, "What?" He goes, the only thing I want Lockjaw in the book," because he was a big Bulldog fan. So he's like, "I want the Bulldog." So put Lockjaw in there. So I said, "Okay." He goes, "Give me a list of what characters you would put in there." And so I was like, Red Wing and, Frog Thor I want in there. I want to create that. I wanted Lockheed. I wanted the cat, which I renamed Hairball because Speedball Hairball. I thought it was really funny. And then I loved Aunt May's dog, Miss Lion, I think it's
Miss Lion, yeah.
And I said, but Miss Lion is actually a boy. And like, I don't know why we thought that was really funny, but it was. And so I kind of sent him the pitch idea about them finding the Infinity Gems, and we went to town, and that was it. It was a lot of fun. Iguaro is like a fantastic artist. He created realistic looking animals that actually like gave expression. It was just it was amazing to watch. It was a fun project.
So speaking of animals, so I mean, at the day we're recording, you just posted your website yesterday an update about an upcoming book of yours about how to turn a pig into a chipmunk,
Yes.
which is such a funny, like really interesting peek into your creative process. So I recommend people do check out your personal website to read this story. But what can you tell us about the upcoming Imaginoodles?
So this one it's about a shy, anxiety-ridden hedgehog who moves in next door to this outgoing, imaginative chipmunk, and who tries to teach him how to imagine things, and it's fun. But Henry the Hedgehog is kind of shy and afraid to do this imagination thing because what they're imagining comes to life. And then there's, I know I'm explaining this really poorly, a lizard that believes she's a dragon. So basically it's teaching kids that it's okay to be silly and look stupid in front of other people. It's actually a fun thing to do. So,
which sounds great, but again, your process here about how you even got to a chipmunk, I thought was hilarious, and also just a fascinating glimpse at what works and what can't, and that originally was supposed to be a pig, and how long into the process it was still a pig, and then you're like, it's not funny enough. And even like you have a great kind of sketch where you show a sequence happening with it as a pig and then instead as a chipmunk, and you can see how it does work better. But it's fascinating glimpse into your creative process.
It's funny, just like with lettering, I got into doing picture books. I was like, how hard could it be? There's fewer words. And, that's the kiss of death, right? I mean, I got that as a letter. I'd get people coming up to me, I can't draw, I can't write, but lettering is easy. And plus I have good handwriting. I could be a letterer. And like, you just get insulted and you just go, man. And I get that a lot now too with picture books. Oh, I want to write picture books. It's got to be easy. There's only a few words a page. And I will honestly say, not to be self-serving, but it is a lot more difficult than people think. To cut out words, to edit down, to get your basic idea across in the most simplistic manner without being simplistic, like sort of being, getting it across and being smart and kind of getting things. And then the art has to be top notch. It's a lot harder. And sometimes it takes a lot longer than you think. I'm like, I'll get a book done in a week. It'll be easy. And then I read stories about how like it took Ted Geisel, Dr. Seuss, like a year to do a book. And these days I kind of go, I get it. You really got to work hard at this to make it better. So it's a different world than comics. It's a lot slower. It's a lot more careful. Like it's funny. Like I'll work on a comic, and 3 weeks later it's on the stands. I'm working on a book currently that won't be out until. Well, I don't want to give the date away just because if somebody listens to this years from now, it's basically like a year and 2 months. Like, so it's like 14, 15 months from now, it'll come out.
Wow.
So it's like crazy, like unbelievable how slow that goes. But, that's the fun of it all, is to sort of take your time and do it right. So without having that monthly grind.
Well, of course. I feel like at some point I should have you come back to do a proper conversation about Ordinary People Change the World. But a quick question about it is that first of all, the stories are wonderful. You and Brad are just, each one is just a fantastic distillation of a person. What I'm so curious about is how early in the process did you guys kind of decide the visual language of using the subject of the book as kind of looking like an adult throughout, to kind of keep a consistent visual, but still in a very childlike way. Like it's fascinating to look at. Like you see Walt Disney, he always looks that way, but he's like a child, and he's kind of they remain consistent throughout. Was that obviously it was a very conscious decision, but I'm curious what it was like for you and Brad to kind of come upon that.
So the way it started, so when Brad got in touch with me, he handed me a paragraph. It was he did a book called Heroes for My Daughter, another book, Heroes for My Son. And he took the Amelia Earhart section. It was just like a paragraph long. And he goes, here, take this and make it into a children's book. So I had to go through it all and figure out what this could be. And early on, we had done like T-shirts with the heroes as little kids. So I liked the idea of just keeping them as a kid. I thought, like we always see them as, statues. We see them as full-formed adults. But I remember as a kid, remember in kindergarten, you'd be out at the supermarket and you'd see your teacher and you'd be like, wait a minute, they have a life outside of the classroom? Like you can't picture, or your parents, you can't picture them as little kids. And so the idea was these kids need to understand that Abraham Lincoln was a kid just like them, or Amelia Earhart was just a kid just like they are. And so it clicked at one point in the story. She has to work a number of jobs to make money to buy flying lessons. And one of those jobs is driving a truck. And I had the image just hit me of this little girl sitting behind the wheel of this big giant truck. I thought it was hysterical. And so I did that. And Brad was like, but she's an adult. And I said, I kind of think she needs to stay as a kid. And he goes, I really like it. I'm just wondering. And so we present, our Jody, our agent, represented us. We went to the publisher. And as we were in the process, our publisher had said, maybe she should age. We got to show her older. And there's a point later on where she's getting flying lessons. And there's a drawing of her teacher, and the plane. And I did it as a little kid. And then I tried it as an adult. I had told them all. I said it's not going to work, and I sent it to them. They literally looked at it and said, "Yep, they're staying as kids the whole way." So basically, the idea is to find an avatar for them. So you find out what is the look of the character that is most recognizable. Like if you were to look up in Wikipedia, Amelia Earhart, what would you see? Or if you look up Abraham Lincoln, what would you see? And translate to them as a kid looking that way. And really, that's where I think we hit it differently, because there's so many people copying this now. There's so many other books out there that have taken that formula and sort of matched it. So it sort of works in that, wherever I go, kids are always like, they're just like me. It's like, yep, that's the point. So it's fun. It's and then we carried it over to Xavier Riddle in the Secret Museum on PBS. And so they see those characters the same way in both the books and the TV show. So there's a connection there. And so it kind of works out well that they look like kids all throughout.
Which avatar do you think was the hardest for you to kind of nail or to figure out? Because as you mentioned, like some of them do feel a little simpler, not simpler, but like easier to kind of close your eyes and be like, okay, well, I think that's what the character should look like. As you said, like Abe Lincoln, Walt Disney, those ones seem on the face of them to be easier to kind of find that avatar that everyone kind of understands that's who that person is. So which of those was more difficult to kind of narrow down?
There's always, so like Amelia Earhart was our first one. And so I originally drew her with, the flying helmet on, the goggles, and then the jumpsuit. And they all worried that she looked too much like a boy. I'm like, but that is what she's known for. And they got, I guess, a little nervous. They said, can you put her in like a little skirt and a, sweater? And I was like, all right, that's fine. But I kept the hat, on. And so, you don't really see her hair or anything. But so that one was kind of off. Sometimes we have other problems. Like I wanted to give Lucille Ball the look, that famous look of the dotted dress with the, and the person that owns her estate, I guess you want to say, said no to it and wanted something different, which I thought was crazy. But so we did that. But like there's weird ones like like Rosa Parks. Like there's not like she's not like very cartoonish. She doesn't have a look to her that says, oh, that's Rosa Parks. Like she's an African-American woman wearing glasses and a dress. Like I usually draw her with like holding a toy bus just so you get the idea of who she is. John Lewis, a bald black man. That could be any number of people. So there've been a few over the times that we've done this where it hasn't been exact, but most people get it. Like I can't think of one that, other than those like that really caused a problem where we went, who is this?
I'm curious what it was like, just because, again, you're dealing with, for the most part, historical figures or people who, if they're still alive, are at least older. And whereas you have a person like Malala, who is obviously very different. And it's like a younger person who's still very present and still making an impact. Is it different approaching that, both for you and Brad? Because it's a very different person in the zeitgeist as opposed to someone like Oprah, for example, who's been around a long time. Like everyone kind of get, I'm not going to say they get Oprah, but you know what I mean? Like there's, Oprah has been a part of the culture for a long time. And then you have someone who's very young and still having that impact. What was it like for both of you to tackle that kind of project?
Yeah. So when we go through the list of people that want to do it, so it's me, Brad, and our publisher, we get to run through and we all kind of make decisions and who we think is going to be the next one. We base it on different variables. It's, who haven't we, what demographic haven't we covered, or, what part of the world have we not seen, that kind of thing. We're kind of trying to expand outward. But a big thing, so when Brad was doing Heroes for My Son, he wanted to put in Lance Armstrong. And so he had written it up. It was in the book. And at the last minute, he's like, I don't feel right about this. I'm going to pull him out. And then like right after the book was published, the doping scandal kicked in where they found out that he was doping while he was cycling. And he's like, ooh, dodged a bullet. So a lot of the choices we make, we try to keep it somebody who's already passed. Like they can't make any more mistakes. Nothing can get worse. Like, something like that can't happen. But in a few cases, we've chosen people who are alive. Mostly, if you notice, they are women. and mostly they are a bit older. Like there's not much they could do to like really screw things up. Like Jane Goodall, you don't think is going to screw things up. Billie Jean King is not going to screw anything up. Malala, I think, even though she's young, we feel like she's sort of shown she's impeccable. Like there's nothing, we're not going to one day find out that she was, killing squirrels in our backyard or something, like nothing crazy like that. So yeah, but we have to make sure. And then, and it's hard because, they could screw up still. But Dolly Parton is great. We don't think she's going to screw anything up. In fact, she's amazing. So, but for the most part, even on the TV show, we've tried to make sure that if we do somebody that's still alive, we get in touch with them, we work with them, make sure that things are right, that we don't get any bad feelings about it. Like we're not trying to screw them over. We're not trying to make them look bad. And and then we do that even with the estates for people who have passed. We deal with family members. We've talked to everybody. Like you look at every one of these books, we've talked to family members if we can, their estates if we can. In the case of Disney, we went to the Disney company as well as the family. For Henson, we went to the family, we went to Sesame Street and the Disney company. But just to make sure that we get it right and we don't screw things up. So we've been lucky so far, knock wood, that we haven't had any major issues.
Okay, I promise this will be my last question.
Yeah.
I'm taking so
all
much
good.
of your time.
No, it's all good.
We'll
be like Judd. I'll come back every year and just.
There we go. I'll take it.
Right.
With Stephen Hawking, I mean,
Yes.
that's a very interesting one just in terms of the visual, because you also it has to feel right. You have to kind of get the chair right and it has to feel right, but also still be adapted to, a simpler cartoony style. Was that a challenge for you to be able to kind of get it right?
Yeah, I did the chair a couple of times. Well, it's weird. So this is one of the first times where he's not the same throughout. And we were trying to figure it out. In the beginning, would we have him in the wheelchair initially? Like, because usually it's fully formed when you get to the first page. But we realized part of his story, a big part of his story, is the fact that he does lose the ability to walk and do all these other things over time. And it's how he adapted to those things. So initially he's walking around. I tried to keep it as minimal as possible. Like he's sitting down a lot, he's kneeling down, or, he's not always walking. And then at some point we have him in crutches. But then getting to the wheelchair, when I was doing that, at first it was I went by his final wheelchair, which is pretty complex. And everybody was kind of like, yeah, that's too much. Like it's going to look too much. Like, and plus, how do you make this giant, like you couldn't have like this little kid in this giant wheelchair. So I did a number of designs. I brought it down. I brought the size of the wheelchair down sort of to fit with the size of a kid. I looked at a lot of pictures of children who were in wheelchairs and the ratio there, and simplified the wheelchair enough that it doesn't look scary. That was the other concern I had, was that you don't want to make it look to a child that it's a scary thing. We did Anne Frank, which is a scary book, and you don't want to get to the point where the kids are like horrified. And so I simplified the chair, and by the end, it's a very uplifting story, even with his disabilities. And I think we kind of got it. So we'll see. We'll see in a few months.
The last one, actually, I promised that was my last one.
No, it's fine.
Breaking that promise.
All good.
I'm curious because it felt like there was a lot more, not kind of buzz, but there was, I guess maybe buzz, a lot of buzz about the Fred Rogers one. So I'm curious what that was like for you, because it felt like that one meant more for Brad. So did you also feel that same way?
I will say I think we had to choose the order of books. Like we had landed on Fred Rogers and RBG and Dolly Parton, like all around the same time, and we're trying to figure out. And then John Lewis was involved too, and so we sort of had to figure out when we were coming out with them. But when we launched the TV show, we went to the Library of Congress. We presented to a crowd at the Library of Congress, which is insane as it is. And we were talking about the fact that, we grew up on PBS, and I had made a statement that I learned my ABCs and my numbers from Sesame Street, but I learned my morals from Mr. Rogers. And so he was right on our list in the beginning, and I was a big champion of him. And Brad picked up the ball. The thing which is good with the two of us is he's great at promotion. He's great at marketing. He's great on TV. I am like the true cartoonist. I'm much better at home, quietly doing my work and not going out in public. But so he's really good at getting out there and sort of selling it and embodying, in this case, Mr. Rogers. So and he's always said he wants to be the next Mr. Rogers. So but we both I was so happy with this book, and it was great to see so many people loved it and picked it up. And each time I do these books, I do a ton of research myself. Brad does tons of research. I'm so knee deep in the next. I won't even say character, because we're doing the next one I'm doing right now. Coming up soon is our first We Are. So I've been doing a ton of research, and I fall in love with each character every time I do it. Like, I just, man, female, I fall in love with these people because their stories are amazing. So I fell in love with Mr. Rogers. I fell in love with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Fell in love with Jesse Owens. I fell in love with Stephen Hawking. Like, I think these people are amazing. So I'm as big a fan as Brad projected for both of us on the media landscape.
Excellent. Well, again, thank you so much for taking so much of your time today. It was a pleasure to be able to talk about, again, obviously your Marvel work, but also getting into The Ordinary People Change the World, because they are such wonderful books.
I appreciate it.
I remember years ago when I first spoke with Judd about Hilo, and he was saying how, he'd written all these very dark, stories that he couldn't let his kids read. So he wanted something that his kids could read, because his kids kept coming home and saying, "Man, Bone is great." And he's like, "I need mine."
Yeah.
And it's nice to have something that I can share with my family, with my kids, because, comics are not always for kids anymore. They're much more adults. So being able to have these great, cartoon books, to be able to have them learn about, really important people and have such great stories that you and Brad have put together is really a treat.
I appreciate it. Yeah, same thing. We did. I mean, we basically made the books for our kids who are now fully grown, but it was definitely that thing. Like, I want to give something to my kids and say, "Hey, this is what Dad's doing, and here are some people that you might want to be emulating." So, so yeah, we've had, and they've got to experience the whole run, so they're bored by it already.
I mean, that's what your children are supposed to do, right? Be first excited by what you do, and then completely bored by it. Yeah,
they were always sort of bored by me. They couldn't understand. I mean, they didn't understand anything until high school, when I mentioned that I'm friends with Robert Kirkman, and they were like, "The guy that created Walking Dead." So like, that was like the end of all things. They were. Then I had a smidgen of coolness. And they got that. I took him to a show, and they got to meet Robert, and he was sweet to them. He just went through their store at the convention, just grabbed everything and handed it to them. They were like in heaven. So for a small period of time, I was pretty cool, but that was it. That was like the only time.
Well, again, thank you so much for gracing us with all these wonderful stories.
My pleasure. It was good talking to you.